I want to thank the Athletic Club because they've accommodated us. For some reason, there was a scheduling snafu, and we're not officially sort of on their books, but they still made room and space for us and gave us a beautiful place to meet. So my apologies that we did not take better care of you. When we report this to JLAC, it means we'll have a lower net spend. So there is a bright side to that. But thank you for coming out here this morning. It's a very important issue that I think we're privileged to present some great data on. We're going to have we'll have Dr. Woolard here to present some opening remarks. We'll have Vlad Kogan from Ohio State here to talk about his latest data, dig into the numbers, and then I think we have a really great panel that will sort of talk a little bit about what this means in Ohio and where we're going. So normally when I do, let me back up for a second. Thank you for being here today. Mark your calendars. The official announcement will be coming out probably the end of this week. But on October 17th, and this one is on the books, so we will have refreshments, we'll be having another event here, at the same time, same channel. It will be on education pluralism. So Ashley Berner from Johns Hopkins will be coming in to be a featured presenter, and she's done a lot of writing about looking at what educational choice and pluralism looks like around the world. She's going to be talking about what Europe does, digging into issues related to accountability and transparency and just the availability of various choices. So it'll be great. I will be traveling. So our moderator, we're going to have a guest moderator, it will be Chester Finn. So Fordham's founder and president emeritus will be in town that day to interview, after Ashley, to ask her some questions and to manage this. It should be a pretty exciting event. So again, thank you all for being here today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Interim Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Chris Woolard. I usually don't read from an official bio when introducing someone, especially someone I know as well as Dr. Woolard, but in his case, it's very fitting for this situation. His ODE bio reads, for nearly 2 decades, serving the state of Ohio, Dr. Woolard has focused on improving student achievement through the effective use of school and district data to inform decision-making. With a focus on academic growth, accountability, and strengthening statewide education partnerships, Dr. Woolard champions best practices and collaborative strategies to advance opportunities for all students. And it couldn't be more fitting. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you for that intro. It's great to be here to be in these discussions. These are important conversations. This is high-stakes work. It is so urgent. As Chad mentioned, data is very, very important to me. I've spent years in the department working on data, work cards. The data that you're going to hear about today, and this series of data, kind of going back some years, has been really critical in both understanding where we were out of the pandemic and the improvements that we're making since then, but also sort of the setting the realities of where we're at and where we need to be. I do want to mention the report cards a little bit, because we did have the report cards that came out last week, and in many ways it's that drill down through that accountability lens to understand how schools and districts were doing. We had a very smooth report card rollout. There are many stakeholders that were involved in the design and the redesign. There were many people here who chimed in on the new report cards. We did a report out with the state board yesterday, and kind of summarizing both what we were seeing with some of the principles that were okay with that. One is that we want to have a report card system that has ratings that are valid, fair, accurate representation of performance. We need to make sure that the accountability system is transparent and encourages high expectations for all students, schools, and districts, and less emphasize growth and improvement. And I think that focus on growth and improvement is going to be absolutely critical. So for the first time this year on the report cards that came out, we did have overall summative star ratings. So we saw nearly 90% of districts and 79% of schools that earned an overall rating of 3 stars or more, was translating into meet state standards. When we looked at some of the achievement data, we were seeing continued improvement. For kind of the second year, we are seeing continued achievement and proficiency, but we're not back to where we were before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, we weren't where we wanted to be. And I think that is really important to point out. Many of you very familiar with the state report card. We have a chart on the state report card that looks at the federal subgroups, the performance and proficiency on federal subgroups in both English language arts and math. For the second straight year, we got little green arrows or red arrows on there. And for the second straight year, we saw all green arrows on the chart, which means that every subgroup improved in proficiency in both English language arts and math. Great news. However, if you go back and compare that to before the pandemic, we're not back to where we were. And in fact, in some cases, the gaps are actually bigger now. So we're seeing some good news on improvement, but clearly a lot of work to do. And there is urgency in this. So we're going to continue to build on and learn from this data and these results. About 6 months ago, almost 6 months to the day, we were in this room for a literacy event. We've been focusing on literacy. Only about 60% of Ohio's third graders are proficient readers. The numbers are creeping up, and we saw some incremental improvement this year, but that is not where we need to be as a state. So, with historic investments in the last state budget, led by Governor DeWine and Lieutenant Governor Husted's budget, and the support of the General Assembly, we are focusing on literacy. There are historic investments in the state budget supporting literacy and the implementation of science and reading in all of Ohio's classrooms. And Read Ohio is the initiative and sort of the branding that's being used. It's an exciting statewide effort that's going to encourage improved literacy for all ages, including the implementation of high-quality instructional materials aligned with the science of reading in all Ohio schools. And that work is already underway. So the department is already working on these new requirements. One of those pieces was a survey, a data collection of all districts across the state to understand where they're at in the process, what is the current status of their professional development, what instructional materials that they're using. That survey is out. We're hoping to wrap that up in the coming weeks so that we have a whole statewide picture where everybody is. Likewise, one of the key components of that investment was the investment in literacy coaches for the lowest performing districts in the state. And so the past few months, our team working with educational service centers has been identifying and recruiting those literacy coaches. And a few weeks ago, that first cohort of districts was identified and received word that those literacy coaches are going to be starting to support them later this fall. So a lot of that work to support literacy for the budget is already underway. Likewise, the department has unveiled new no-cost resources to help schools and districts across the state accelerate learning. And this includes many different opportunities for high-dosage tutoring, as well as other programs such as Zern Math. You're going to hear a little bit about math today, and how math is also a major concern when we're looking at data. And so there's a lot of things the department is already working with. Along with literacy in math, I'll point out that attendance remains a concern. It is a priority to reduce chronic absenteeism. So we define chronic absenteeism like many other states as students that are missing 10% or more of the school year. You can sort of predict when students are missing 10% or more, they're less likely to be proficient readers, they're more likely to drop out. Last year, there's some data on the report card, chronic absenteeism rates did improve, but yet we still are 26%. Last year. So previously we were at 30%, so we saw some improvement. But last year, 26, almost 27% of students in the state, over 1 in 4 students in the state was chronically absent. And if you look at our most vulnerable students, are even much more likely to be chronically absent. So we've got lots of supports that are in play. We've been working with our Stay in the Game network, which is a partnership between the department, the Cleveland Browns, and the Columbus Crew Foundation, as well as Proving Ground at Harvard, that are creating an attendance awareness campaign. It is still Attendance Awareness Month in September, so I appreciate you spreading the word on the importance of making sure that students are at school. We also have an attendance task force, and I know David's been participating in that, so we have an attendance task force with educators, nonprofits, and other experts in this space that's been meeting for the past few months, and it's wrapping up work, and it's going to be making some recommendations about how to improve attendance in the state. So again, we're happy that when we look at data that we're trending in the right direction, but we're not where we need to be, and this is urgent. So with that, I'll be kind of just remiss to take a moment and at least mention some of the significant organizational transitions that are taking place at the state level. The new Department of Children and Youth will encompass programs from 6 state agencies to provide services more efficiently to children and their families in the areas of prevention, early education, and support. On October 3rd, the Department of Education will be renamed the Department of Education and Workforce and become a cabinet-level agency reporting to the Governor of Ohio. And the State Board of Education will be a standalone agency that will be overseeing educator licensure, professional conduct, and educator effectiveness. So those are some organizational changes that are sort of taking place, as we speak. So while we are making those changes, the one key takeaway is all of us across all these agencies are dedicated to ensuring that children are at the forefront of every decision that we make. And so thank you for allowing me to have a few minutes to speak with you today, and looking forward to the discussion.
For those of you that need caffeine, there is no coffee. So please help yourself.
So thank you, Dr. Woolard, for being here today, but even more for the leadership that you've shown at what's clearly a very busy time in the state of Ohio in education. It's difficult to lead an agency this size at any time, but doing it with the professionalism that you've shown at a time of transition and an important time for Ohio students is fantastic. So from Fordham, and I'm sure for most of the people in this room, thank you very much for everything you've done. So now I get the pleasure of introducing our keynote, Dr. Vlad Kogan, Professor of Political Science at Ohio State University. So while I appreciate and admire Dr. Kogan's scholarly abilities, and you will too after today's presentation, one of the things I find most fascinating is his ability through his work and prolific Twitter activity, or X activity, to analyze and observe education and social policy through a lens that encompasses both politics and public policy. Not many people can pull that off, but Dr. Kogan does it masterfully. I'm honored he's able to be with us here today to present on his most recent research on Ohio's 2023 spring state exams. Without further ado.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you, Dr. Woolard, and the rest of the Fordham team for organizing an event on this important topic, and for inviting me to present some findings from research that we completed in collaboration with the Ohio Department of Education. And I want to stress before I begin that this presentation really reflects just my interpretation of the evidence. So I'm not speaking on behalf of the Ohio State University, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Ohio Department of Education. So before I begin, I want to recognize the support for this research from ODE, including Superintendent Woolard and Research Director Greg Taylor, as well as other state officials. I think it takes real leadership and courage to do research on sensitive topics such as this one, especially when you don't know what the findings will be when you begin. And another person I really have to mention is former ODE Research Director Heather Boughton. So the results I'm presenting today are from really the 6th report in a series designed to track the impact of the pandemic on Ohio students, as well as the subsequent recovery. Work that we began planning with Dr. Boughton on April 1st, 2020, just weeks after the pandemic began. And it was really through her leadership and kind of visionary foresight that we're able to do this work. Having followed this kind of research from around the country, I can tell you with 100% confidence that really no state has matched Ohio in terms of the detail, the carefulness, and the timeliness of our efforts. And just to illustrate a point, as I was finishing this report in late July, I saw a headline from my former home state of California. There, not only did the State Department of Education make no effort at all to track pandemic academic impacts, but they actually went after 2 Stanford researchers who are taking the initiative to do so on their own, with their own data, including threatening one with a $50,000 fine. So we really need to appreciate how Ohio and our leaders really stand out, I think, on this front. And I think realize that this kind of work doesn't get done on its own without strong leadership support. All right. So the figures I'm going to present are based on preliminary data from the state exams taken by Ohio students last spring. And as Dr. Woolard mentioned, the state report cards went out on Thursday. And so the data I'm sharing is a little bit different than that data. And in particular, the key difference is that I'm applying some additional statistical techniques to account for differences over time in the demographic composition of students attending local schools to make the comparisons as apples to apples as possible. But my estimates are strongly correlated with the district level data from the official report cards, including the performance index scores and the value added growth estimate. I'm going to focus on two key questions. First, how much progress have students made in recovering from the initial learning disruptions and test score declines that we saw in the first year of the pandemic, compared to achievement levels during the 2018 and 2019 school years, the 2 years right before. And then second, how much of the progress that we've seen is due to what we might call learning acceleration, and how much has the amount of actual acceleration varied across different districts and across different students. And so by acceleration, I mean an increase in the rate of test score growth that students experience from one year to the next. So this is similar to value added in the progress measure on the state report card. But one key difference is that I'm measuring an increase or an acceleration in that year-to-year growth relative to the trajectories that were typical before the pandemic. So I'm not asking how much are students learning, but are they learning more or faster than they used to? And because only such increases can help students make up any lost ground. So let's jump right to the findings. We have really great news on English and language arts achievement, which has largely returned, or in some cases even surpassed pre-pandemic levels in most grades on average. And that on average, as Dr. Woolard mentioned, is really important. And I'll discuss that in a few minutes. So you can see in this figure is the changes in the ELA test scores, again, relative to pre-pandemic years. And on the y-axis, you see percentages because I've normalized these estimates for each grade to the amount of learning we see in a regular school year, so that you can interpret the difference of the percent of a full year of learning for that year. And then these are just ballparks. I would not take these very literally, but gives you a sense of the magnitude. The red bars, which show large declines in most grades, are from spring 2021, the first year of the pandemic. And the solid black bars are from last spring. And as you can see, with the exception of fourth grade, where students remain about a quarter of a year behind, we've seen dramatic recovery over the past 2 years. I should mention that this is a uniquely Ohio story. So national data from private assessment companies like iReady and NWA Map show little evidence of catch-up growth in the same time period in the same grade of subjects. In math, the recovery has not been as robust. The score is still considerably lower than in the years immediately before the pandemic. In elementary grades, the shortfall last spring represented about a quarter of a year of learning. And in middle school grades and higher, the gaps remain even larger, about half a year or more. There you go. You can see this pattern in this figure. Again, the red bars are the initial declines in spring 2021, and the solid black bars are the scores from last year. Again, on the y-axis, it's normalized to show gaps in the percent of a typical year of learning. And on the right side, the last two you can see I've included some high school grades, so Algebra 1 in 9th grade and Geometry in 10th grade. And although the scores have improved somewhat from the low point in spring of 2021, students remain considerably behind. That the oldest students remain most behind, I think, should be a cause of concern because they, especially students who were in 10th grade last year, which means they're in 11th grade now, they have very, very little time to make up the lost ground before they graduate next year. All right. So the same pattern shows up in my estimates of learning acceleration, which show significant increases in year-to-year growth compared to pre-pandemic periods in most grades of ELA, but not for math. And while I'll only focus on math and ELA in the slides here, in the full report, which you can find online, we also examined science and social studies. And scores in these subjects have followed similar patterns, posting substantial declines in the spring 2021, but also recovering substantially over the subsequent 2 years in most cases. Overall, students appear to have returned closer to pre-pandemic achievement in elementary and middle school science, with larger shortfalls in high school biology, U.S. history, and U.S. government. So as I mentioned, the statewide average story masks important variation, including across districts. And you can see that most strikingly in my estimates of district-level learning acceleration rates over the past 2 years, which I've plotted separately for ELA in red and math in blue. Again, as I mentioned, these are pretty strongly correlated with official value-added progress ratings, but again, they're somewhat different. They measure a different concept. And I want to highlight several patterns in these figures. So first, note that in ELA, most of the estimates are to the right of 0, and I have a little arrow for you at 0, indicating an increase in year-to-year test score growth relative to pre-pandemic rates. In other words, these are districts where students are now learning more each year than was the case before the pandemic. In math, by contrast, the estimates are concentrated around 0, indicating no acceleration. And you can also see a significant number of districts have negative estimates, indicating slower year-to-year growth than we saw in the years before the pandemic. So students in these districts are falling further behind instead of catching up. And I want to call out several important patterns. First, districts that saw the largest achievement decline during the first year of the pandemic are not seeing faster recovery in the subsequent 2 years. And so you can see that in these graphs. So I grouped districts together based on their initial test score declines in spring 2021, and I standardized these. And so that's what's on the x-axis is the initial decline. Further to the left you are, the more your scores decline. And each dot represents a group of districts with similar initial declines. And on the y-axis, I plot the cumulative learning acceleration over the past 2 years, with larger numbers higher corresponding to greater growth. So dots located on the left side of each panel represent districts with the largest initial declines. If they had a faster subsequent recovery, you'd expect them to appear higher on the y-axis, with a downward sloping line. In fact, you see the opposite, an upward sloping line, meaning that districts that experienced the largest initial losses have actually grown slower over the past 2 years relative to their pre-pandemic growth trajectories. In addition, I examined the amount of federal pandemic aid, including the 3 ESSER allocations each district received per pupil, to see if districts that received more funding were able to accelerate learning to a greater extent. I found no evidence that this was the case. So these plots are very similar to what I just showed you, except now each dot represents the districts that received a similar amount of pandemic aid per student, and that's what you see on the x-axis. On the y-axis is still cumulative learning acceleration over the past 2 years. So a steep upward sloping line, as you go from left to right, would represent greater acceleration amongst districts receiving more pandemic aid. And you don't see that in either subject. In math, you see a modest positive relationship, but the slope is not steep, meaning that districts that received the most aid did not experience dramatically greater achievement growth over the past 2 years, again, relative to their pre-pandemic trajectories. Now, we should be careful about how we interpret these correlations. Okay, so this is descriptive data, it's not causal. I'm not arguing against providing aid, which districts may have used for many other worthy projects, including increasing support and mental health services, and also upgrading their HVAC. And importantly, I'm only focusing on the amount of money districts received, not how much they spent. Although I did over the weekend look at some more recent data from the economics lab at Georgetown on actual spending, and the results are pretty similar. But what is clear, I think, is that counting on federal pandemic aid to address achievement declines is not going to get the job done. We need to think about a broader set of long-term strategies, including after next year, when the last pandemic dollars will have been spent. Finally, the report does not examine student attendance because those records are not finalized until later in the summer. But I did take a look at the district-level attendance figures that were released last week as part of the report cards. And overall, surprisingly, there's not a strong relationship between either attendance or chronic absenteeism and learning acceleration over the past 2 years. And I want to be very clear, I want to be careful to make sure that you don't misunderstand what I mean. It doesn't mean that attendance is not important. And it doesn't mean that attendance does not predict student achievement growth. It absolutely does. Just as both attendance and chronic absenteeism predicted year-to-year growth before the pandemic. It's simply the case that districts with high attendance already had high growth before the pandemic. They're not districts that have accelerated that growth. So what it really tells us is that the districts that have accelerated the growth are not the districts that have done the best in maintaining or improving their attendance. Clearly, they're pulling some other lever, right, to get those impressive results. And we should understand what those other levers are, just as we continue to focus on attendance for, I think, very good reasons. All right. So let me just pause on a question that maybe for this audience is not an important question, but some might raise. Do test scores really matter? Should we focus on other things, like social emotional learning, mental health, and other important things that we all care about? And if the evidence is overwhelming that test scores do matter, so for example, here's a chart I took from Harvard economist Raj Chetty, who linked kindergarten standardized test scores, in Tennessee with these students' IRS tax records later in life. And you can see scores are highly predictive of later life outcomes, including college attendance. And again, these are test scores from kindergarten. In fact, we know that standardized tests, although far from perfect, and measured with great noise, particularly at the level of the individual student, are in the aggregate robust predictors of later life outcomes, including college success, early adult earnings, criminal justice involvement, and economic growth and innovation. So getting students back on track academically is important not only for their future, but really for all of our long-term success. And also many of the critiques of high-stakes testing, such as teaching to the test, really cannot explain the sudden decrease in test scores that we saw during the first year of the pandemic, right? Because no one's incentivized to do worse and get lower test scores. So just as we can maybe explain away increases, I think those critiques don't apply to the decreases we see, and they are very concerning. And I mention this because we know for high school students in particular, math scores are particularly strong predictors of post-secondary success. So we should not rest on our laurels and be satisfied with our success in ELA. It's important that we get students back on track in math as well. Let me now conclude with some main takeaway points and potentially policy implications that will hopefully set up our discussion. First, I think we have to recognize the good news. So our ELA gains are truly spectacular, and as I mentioned, very different from the stagnation we have seen in national data. So clearly, academic recovery is possible in Ohio. And now we just have to figure out how to scale up what we've done with ELA and do the same thing with math. So second, there are clearly large differences across districts. So we should be able to figure out what the most successful districts have done, so we can bottle it and give it out to everybody else. And we should focus on the districts that are lagging behind to understand what barriers they face. So third, we need to be quite intentional and focused as we move forward, identifying specific subjects, specific grades, specific student subgroups, and in specific schools where the recovery is lagging. So there's a lot of variation in this data, and the one-size-fits-all approach is probably not going to work. And in particular, I think we need to be much more focused on older students. So a few weeks ago, when the Columbus Dispatch ran a piece on our report, and I know Anna's here, I quoted one prominent official saying it's too late for older students, and we should focus on younger kids and universal pre-K. And I have no problem with pre-K, but if that means giving up on our current middle and high school students, I think that would be a colossal and devastating mistake. So finally, I think we should demand stronger evidence that the policy levers districts say they're pulling to achieve academic recovery will actually work. So I think our initial theory of action, which is basically dumping a bunch of money on school districts with the hope that they'd spend it to address achievement declines effectively, with few strings attached and little oversight, probably wasn't very good. And I think we might now be maybe repeating the same mistake by really emphasizing attendance to the exclusion of other things that we could be talking about and focusing. We should really focus, I think shift the focus from inputs, whether it's adult inputs like spending on staffing and student inputs like attendance, both important, but really focus on the outcomes we care about and make sure that we have the incentives aligned and the accountability aligned to really deliver the outcomes that we want from Ohio students. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Kogan. And see, I'm sure you were not disappointed. And so now it's time to shift to our panel presentation. Hopefully, Dr. Kogan's presentation raised some questions for you. After I ask a few questions of the panelists, we will shift to make sure you get a chance to ask your questions as well of the panelists and Dr. Kogan. So, Jennifer wants to join me. As Jennifer's coming up here to join our panel, I will introduce the panelists. I'll do it rather quickly, so if you want the more extended bios, they'd be happy to provide them afterward. So in addition to Dr. Kogan joining us on the panel, my Fordham colleague, Aaron Churchill, Ohio's Research Director, is here this morning. We're also pleased to be joined by Dave Taylor. Dave is the Superintendent and CEO of the Dayton Early College Academy, a high-performing community school network in Dayton. And last but not least is Jennifer Felker. Jennifer is Superintendent of the Educational Service Center of the Western Reserve in Northeast Ohio. So, all right, let's get after it. So this first question is for Jennifer and Dave. And by the way, I have told them, answer the questions, be brief, no filibustering, so we can get to as many questions as possible. So Jennifer and Dave, Dr. Kogan has presented the data. Any reactions, any surprises? How does it match up with what you're seeing in your schools, in your communities, with real kids and not just numbers?
First, just to give a little background about our ESC, we're in Northeast Ohio, and I represent probably about 15 to 20 school districts that are of suburban, urban, and very rural. So we have a very diverse population. Within that structure, I think, and I'm a former ODE-er, I'll call it, and worked for the State Department, but probably we're pushing decade plus that the third grade guarantee was put in statute. We've also had intensive literacy initiatives that are been in legislation, especially for dyslexia, professional development, etc., that have really been a high-level focus on literacy. When we look at the data and we talk specifically about the research in mathematics and the gains, especially looking at what we've experienced with COVID and not being necessarily engaged in school, more online learning in many districts, we are looking at it's difficult in the homes we talked about with math. Specifically, a lot of our families do not have the background, especially the content specific, that need for middle grades to higher grades. So we've really talked intensively about that at the school level due to the fact that we just don't have the supports in home necessarily as much as we do for literacy. And that state statutes have put forward a great deal of efforts in literacy. And as we go forward, the research I think is going to portray, we really need, and I'm not a big fan of putting things in statutes to put forward in the schools specifically, as I represent pretty much all the ESCs here today, but we do see efforts being made and gains with literacy compared to math.
Yeah, I think going through and listening to this data, it's sobering, first and foremost. I think we can look at the damage done via the pandemic, and I think Dr. Wood said it earlier really well, that we weren't where we wanted to be before the pandemic. And so I represent a small number of charter schools in Dayton, and our schools are, the vast majority of our students have to be Black. 97% of our students are students of color, with 95% of those students being Black. And what we've encountered is that as we're looking at our data, as we're looking at how challenging it's going to catch up, we don't seem to be moving as fast as some of our suburban counterparts. And kind of talking to, listening to this data and hearing and reading through the reports, so you begin to see that this isn't just happening in our schools. This is happening really disproportionately in communities of color across our state and across our country, and that is a great concern to me. So certainly we're seeing much larger gains in literacy. I can talk you through some of the things that we're doing and putting in place to actually see our literacy scores rebound. But we continue to be alarmed, really K through 12 with our math progress. And so this certainly aligns with my intuition. I wish if my intuition was wrong. This doesn't provide me with a great deal of comfort.
Thank you. Aaron, Dr. Kogan's presentation made a compelling case that there are some big challenges in front of schools and Ohio students, especially for the most disadvantaged students. What do you see as one of the biggest hurdles?
Sure, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Kogan, for the great research effort. And it's online, and some of its past reports for the previous couple of years are also online. It's been tremendous to see the year-over-year progress that Ohio's made and that he's documented, and also the number of the challenges that the state and our schools still have moving ahead. So thank you for that, and thank you to the Department of Education, too, for facilitating that research. One thing that Dr. Woolard and Professor Kogan both mentioned, I think, was the issue of urgency and the need to continue to move forward on achievement and on attendance. And I know we've heard a lot of data, but I'll just, there's a couple other pieces that I just want to highlight from the report card that came out. If we look at chronic absenteeism numbers, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, they have gone up very significantly since the prior to the pandemic. So before statewide, 16% of students statewide were chronically absent, and this means that students are missing 10% of the school year. That's 18 days in a 180-day calendar. So that's significant lost learning time that can be used for students to make progress. And it also hurts schools, teachers. They have to go back and try to redo the curriculum with students when they're not attending school. So attendance is critical. And if you look at the district level on this, on the report cards, we see some very significant increases in chronic absenteeism. If you look at Youngstown, 59% of students were chronically absent last year. In Lorain, it was 59% as well. Garfield Heights, 58.6. East Cleveland, 58% of students were chronically absent last year. And in Columbus, right here, 58% of students were chronically absent. That's a lot of lost learning time that we need to make sure that we're using properly. And then if you just look at the raw achievement numbers too, it's important, and I've been looking at the test data for a decade or so. It's always eye-opening to just see the achievement data. If we look at Columbus, 45% of students were scoring limited last year, and that's the lowest achievement level on state exams. When you're scoring limited, that means you're receiving about 25 to 35% of the points possible on the state assessment. So we have a lot of work to do still in Ohio. Obviously, we've seen some tremendous progress, and I think we should continue to leverage that, especially in literacy around the efforts we're making. That's been tremendous. But you know, as Dave said, when we look at the data, it's still sobering to see how much work there is to move the needle on achievement to where we want to see it. So thank you, Professor Kogan, and looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Dave, when you gave your comments a moment ago, I could feel sort of the passion and sort of the urgency, and frustration is not the right word, but you know, I mean. So what is DECA doing to help get its students back on track? Are you pleased with sort of some of the progress you're making and seeing now, even though you know there's still a lot in front of you?
Yeah, I think that it's something that I try to remind myself and my staff all the time. We can look at data, we can look at you know, kind of things that we have in place. We have to recognize that these kids will only have 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade one time. We have one time to get this right with these students, and if we don't do it, we set them back permanently. And so this isn't you know, an academic exercise. This is real, especially for the kids that we serve. If they don't get a good education from us, that's on us. And so we're taking this very seriously. You know, we got on the boat really early with high dosage tutoring. That's been something that we've hired at our elementary school. We have 17 tutors on staff who are pushing into our literacy classes all day long. And so every student is getting, every single student in school is getting, you know, work with a tutor in groups of no larger than 3 for 20 minutes a day, focusing on structured phonics. And so that's happening in our elementary school. We also have an extended day for our lowest achieving students. And so they stay after school for an extra hour every day, getting literacy support at our elementary school. And we're actually just launching it at our middle school now, focusing on math. And so we have those students staying after with our tutors and with teachers to make sure they're getting it. And that's Monday through Friday, all school year long. Their school day is 1 hour longer than everybody else's. We also believe that this can't be a school-only intervention. We have to make sure that our parents are engaged in this. So we have honest conversations with our parents about here's where your child is. And so we have quarterly parent meetings for parents whose children are behind. We want them to sit down and understand this is exactly where they are, exactly what we're doing. Here's how we're asking you to get involved, and here's what next looks like. And we thought parents were going to really resist that extra urgency, that extra need. We provide gas cards for parents to come in. We'll do meetings over Zoom. We've been really, not shocked, but pleasantly, we've been pleased with how engaged our parents have been and how passionate they've been about stepping up to help their children move forward. They're less helpful in middle school because middle school math is hard. We don't necessarily know how to do that as parents, but elementary school literacy, we've seen parents really eager to make sure that they're providing support at home to push things forward. And the last thing I'll say, this isn't an academic intervention, but we were not equipped for the number of mental health supports we had to provide our students coming out of PICA. We had great systems in place, and what we found is that when students returned, those systems were taxed across the board, and it really impeded our ability to offer excellent academic instruction. And so we've had to really go back and provide quite a few additional supports where we've had to hire extra social workers, we've had to bring in community support so we can offer more resources in school to pull kids out for counseling. Those supports have helped us create a learning environment for students to move forward. So we're seeing progress, it's just not fast enough.
Thank you. That's some impressive work. Jennifer, what supports are your ESC and others around the state providing to catch students up?
So we have been fortunate to have a lot of partnerships with the Ohio Department of Education and supports for COVID relief and extended learning. Prior to even some of those dollars coming into the schools, we actually purchased a building from one of our school districts that was doing a new facilities plan as a tutoring center. So we have tutored thousands and thousands of students in our area free of charge to families, and also as a resource center for supports to families in need. So we have created clothing banks and food banks and supplies for them. That also was a distribution center for us for PPE during COVID. So the facility itself, being a resource to the community, has been amazing. But we have really looked at what we need to do for our literacy and math. We have summer programming. We have different types of programming for different students, identifying them and their needs. In addition, we also deploy literacy and math coaches in all of our schools. Those are relatively new the last 2 years. Many ESCs across Ohio, to speak of the ESC level, have embedded, embraced the tutoring concept before school, after school, and in summer intensive reading programs. Specifically for mathematics, we are looking at curriculum alignment in a lot of math curriculum. So we've increased our staff supports and having a significant amount of curriculum instruction team, content-specific specialists to go into schools, especially for looking at alignment. Districts really need to look at what they're embraced in terms of instructional materials and resources. We've also partnered with the High Department of Ed to HQIM, which is high quality instructional materials, free resources, as I know Chris mentioned, or Dr. Woolard earlier, is really important. Those resources and also looking at materials and assessing what's being instructed. We have done extensive professional development. We have a professional development catalog that we actually embed into school districts. The days of people coming to a PD are really kind of gone. We need to look at how do we go into schools, how do we embrace and provide professional development. I was actually asked a question earlier today about how do we provide PD and get the opportunity. We have a lack of substitutes to challenge. We have an extreme lack of content-specific specialists, and unfortunately, if you look at the research, we have a declining population of going into the profession of education right now, and that's going to continue over the next decade. So we need to find these folks. We need to find creative ways, but we also have to find creative ways to provide professional development to teaching staff. And that needs to be, we typically have 3 PD days and most average, of time given to schools for, most school districts, but we need to find ways that they have early release, late releases to find that opportunity for professional development.
Thank you. We'll ask one more question. Give Dr. Kogan and Aaron a chance to weigh in, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And if you let me down and have no questions, I have plenty more. But I would like the opportunity for you to ask your questions as well. So the last question for Dr. Kogan and Aaron. How do you think the continued challenges around student achievement will impact student success post-high school, in higher ed, whether it's community college or university?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so again, as I mentioned, we know that test scores in the aggregate, I think, are strong predictors. But I would also stress that I think test scores are capturing something deeper, and we know that they're measuring one aspect of achievement and one aspect of performance. And there's a broader suite of non-cognitive skills that I think in the long run are probably more important. And the challenge is we don't measure them. We don't measure them well. And I suspect that the pandemic, in the same way that it has disrupted academic achievement, has disrupted the development of those other skills. And I think that disruption is probably going to have even more profound impact in the long run for thinking about higher education or thinking about workforce and other dimensions of kind of long-term well-being. And unfortunately, we don't have good data. We can't track it, so we don't know if we're recovering on that front as well. But I suspect that this is a proxy for a broader suite of disruptions that will have tremendous long-term impact for the students themselves, and again, for all of us, because again, we have a single economy, and some of these other issues like criminal justice involvement obviously affect not just the people involved in those activities, but obviously the victims of those crimes. And so we all have, I think, skin in the game, and so I think we all have collective responsibility for making sure that these are addressed.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Dr. Kogan said, but to go back to the issue of not to belabor on it, but the issue of chronic absenteeism. When you think of a chronically absent student, I mean that is worrisome that they're not going to school for some particular reason. We don't know all the reasons why students, it could be bullying, it could be that they're missing the bus too much and transportation is not reliable. But it does raise some questions, and there's a report by ODE that looked at chronic absenteeism by grade level, and it's more prevalent in high school. And so it makes you wonder, if students are graduating high school and they're attending school inconsistently, what does that look like when they go to the workplace? And so does that have implications for, when they go into their first job, and can they attend school or attend work regularly? If they're not attending school regularly, is that going to translate to inconsistent work performance or even showing up to work? So I think that's another leading indicator as we think beyond test scores a little bit of, what are some predictive measures for when students are going into, who may not be college bound, going into the workforce. And so that's another area of concern when we're looking at high school students who are maybe transitioning into the workforce.
Great, thank you. All right, as promised, questions?
Hi, I have 2 questions. The first, I'm really interested in any kind of observations around data and how much better or worse outcomes would have been without any COVID relief dollars. And then secondly, really interested in the correlation between the absentee schools you just mentioned. 3 of them were subjected to academic distress commissions and state takeovers. So is this further evidence that the ABCs were a failed model that should have been abandoned and that we should have more local control in our school districts?
So I'll take the first question, and maybe I'll jump in. So I think that counterfactual of what would have happened with no aid, I think it's impossible to know, and especially because there are spillovers, right? So when districts got more funding, they went to hire, and that meant often hiring people that work for other districts. So understanding all these interactions, understanding what a world without federal aid would look like, I think it's really an impossible question. I think the only thing we can know from the data is that the districts that got the aid are not recovering faster, which is not an indictment of how they spent the aid. I want to make it clear. But it is telling us that we need to think about other policy levers. We shouldn't just say, oh, they got money and they're good, and it's on them to figure it out, because I don't think that's happening. So I think the attendance issue, I think, is complicated. And again, I want to be really careful how I describe it, in that the districts that saw the biggest increases in chronic absenteeism were also the districts that before the pandemic had really high chronic absenteeism. So, so that's it's a continuation of those trends. And they are districts that are growing less today, but they were also districts that were growing less before the pandemic. Right? So these districts face a lot of challenges, and I think absenteeism is a symptom of these broader issues, and what they are, I think, is very complicated. But again, as I mentioned, I think absenteeism is crucial because not just academically, because when kids are not in school, they're probably out and potentially getting into trouble in other ways. So just having them in school is important. But I don't think that's going to necessarily be enough to address the academic impacts. Just having them be in school, we also have to change what we're doing in school once they're there. And that was the piece I wanted to emphasize, that absenteeism is an important piece, but it's not the goal, right? It's just one of the mechanisms on the road to getting to that goal. And again, on the academic stress commissions, that's beyond my pay grade, so that's a question for Aaron.
That was me. No, I think it's important to understand with some of the districts that I mentioned, is that on a baseline, they had very high chronic absenteeism. So in 2018-19, Youngstown's chronic absenteeism rate, and I'm glad I wrote that, was 42%. And now it's 59.3% post-pandemic. So the districts that were under state supervision through distress commissions did have academic challenges that put them into the situation in the first place. So we have to understand and recognize that. And then I think moving forward, the challenge for districts such as Youngstown, Moraine, and Columbus, and a number of other districts, and especially our urban areas, is to improve student achievement and improve the rates of school attendance. And I think that will take significant efforts, much of which Dave Taylor has already talked about, engaging parents and making sure that they're sort of taking ownership of helping their students get to school on time, the high dosage tutoring, extended learning time. I think all those things need to be on the table to help the kids in those certain communities.
So I would certainly have plenty to add to the academic distress commission question, but I will not today. Maybe we'll bring you back and use that to bring you back for another event at a later date. So, please.
Thanks for doing this. Hi everyone. I'm Diane Assistant State Rep from Cincinnati. My question is, again in two parts. So around the ESSER funding, because I think this is important, because I think based on your presentation, I'm worried people will get the wrong takeaway. I agree what happens in schools matters. My question is, did you break out the relative wealth of the districts by the ESSER funding? So what's the ratio? Because if someone's going home and they're actually in a wealthier environment than their school, the ESSER funding is obviously going to have a more muted impact, or it's going to be easier for it to help. But if a district, people are going from, it's the equivalent of $70 a day to zero, you're going to need way more ESSER funding. So the ratio matters, and without it, I actually think the data is at best irrelevant and at worst harmful. So we have to know the poverty level. So I'm curious, I assume in the larger report you have that data broken out. And then my second question is around whether you saw any outliers that are helpful in low-income rural or urban districts, where you're like, those are the districts, there's something is going on, let's dive in and figure it out, because that would be super helpful.
Yes, so great question. So two things about ESSER. One is the ESSER allocation formula was based on district poverty, right? So areas that got more ESSER funding were the districts that have more poor students. So there's kind of this mechanical relationship. Now, they are districts that have more challenges, obviously. They need more funding, but there are districts that have more challenges before the pandemic, right? So we would expect, once they got the extra funding, we would expect acceleration. We expect their rate of growth to increase, and that's what we didn't find, right? And again, that doesn't mean that the money wasn't well spent on other things, that it wasn't spent on mental health, on nurses, on HVAC improvements. These are also older districts that have older buildings that have more maintenance needs. So I think there was a lot of physical capital issues that they needed to address to reopen safely, and I think a lot of the funding was spent on that. But it doesn't seem like the money was spent on accelerating achievement amongst those same students that they had, again, students that were already disadvantaged. And so again, I'm not saying the money was not well spent. I'm just saying that those districts, which again were poor, but they were poor before the pandemic, they did not seem to have accelerated their rate of growth. So your second question, remind me what it was again.
Were there outliers that
are
in low-income areas?
Yes, so and I think that's why this measure of acceleration is super important, because it's saying, it's not an absolute metric. It's a metric of how much better are you doing than you were doing before. And there are districts that stand out across the board. Urban districts, rural districts, so I think we can identify those districts and try to figure out, what they're doing, and I'm sure that the team at ODE is doing that. So I'm sure I haven't looked at it district by district, and also, I think, So I think there are folks at ODE who are thinking exactly along those lines and trying to figure out first what they're doing and what's working in one context that may be relevant for another context. Because I think that's super important, right? That a policy that works in one district might not be the policy that works with a different student population and different needs that they have, for sure.
So I'm going to do a quick lightning follow-up to your question, a practical application. You're in schools. Federal relief dollars expire next September. What are you doing now that you may not be able to afford to do to provide supports to students when those dollars expire?
Great question, and if I can just add to some of this comment about the impact of federal relief dollars, and I'll speak from the ESC hat of the services and supports and staffing that we've been able to with COVID relief, but also the expansion of services. In addition to our school districts, many have implemented new curriculum. As I mentioned earlier, alignments have happened. Dollars they would not, instructional materials are extremely expensive. Textbooks, even online texts, and many of our districts chose to use those dollars to embed new curriculum instruction materials in schools, which they would not have been able to do if they had not that. So when you look at the trajectory of long-term and data points, sometimes we're not going to see that in immediate, even right now. I would like to see data specifically in the next 2-3 years to see where we were, because we're not going to see the immediate impacts on some of what's been put forward. So I just want to speak for the schools. There's been lots that's been done. And specific is not just hiring people. We expanded our preventive service team. We have deployed about 6-7 additional staff members to help support with, we talked about chronic absenteeism. We have additional attendance officers. And what we're seeing now is sustainability, right? So we talked a long time about, okay, what are we gonna do in September of 2024? What we've done is actually contracted with our districts for those staff members. They've seen the importance, the impact they've had, And now this year, actually, we just looked at budgets last week to look at where we are with the expenses. And many of them we had to back out of COVID relief dollars for this year, because what we want to is to see our districts embracing and wanting those staff members. So we're building a strong sustainability plan right now, but our districts too, I know there was a question too to me this morning about how are they doing with spending those dollars. We do a monthly discussion on that at our superintendent meetings, where we are, how do we, and also sharing what each other are doing is extremely important for the impact of students, and this last year for what we can have impact on. So those are discussions I have relatively every month with the superintendents. In addition, we look internally at our spend monthly to make sure we're on target for the spending of those funds. But it is important that we are looking long-term, that we put programs, services, supports in place that would not have existed prior to COVID. I will tell you that from the ESC world, and to our expansion of our ESC and what we've been able to provide.
I would certainly agree with a lot of what you said. I would add to it, for us, we're a smaller organization. These dollars are difficult to spend because you don't want to build things in that you're dependent upon long term. But there's so many dollars, and the need is so great that we found ourselves in a situation where there are a few things that are on the table now. I mentioned to you before that we're doing high dosage tutoring and extended school day for our students. Those are really expensive items for us. And so, those are on the chopping block, and we're looking for how do we kind of move things around so we can afford them. The other piece that we didn't mention is we've taken over our transportation. You may or may not know that charter schools can rely on the traditional school district to provide transportation. You also, if you follow this world closely, will know that transportation is a disaster in the urban core. It doesn't matter what city you go to, it is a disaster, particularly in Columbus, Cincinnati, and Dayton. I happen to live in Dayton, and that is where it is rough. And so we took the burden off of our district by providing our own transportation. What that's meant is that our students have gotten to school on time. What that meant is that our students get picked up from school. It also meant that we can extend the school day for students at our leisure. We couldn't do that when we were with the district. It is very expensive for us to do that, because we don't have the economies of scale that a larger district does, and this on the chopping block for us as we kind of lose, as those dollars go away. And can I just say something that has nothing to do with that question? I'm sorry, I got the mic, so I'm going to say it. So one topic that we haven't discussed yet that I think should be on the table in terms of why we're seeing some of these challenges crop up, that at least we've seen it, and I read an article from TNTP talked about this recently, is teacher absenteeism. And so, we are, and this is not an anti-teacher comment. I will always consider myself to be a teacher. Please don't miss me with that. What I am trying to say is that in terms of understanding the impact of chronic absenteeism from the student side, we have to look at the fact that teachers are missing more time now than they were before the pandemic. And a lot of that's because of their mental health, a lot of it's because of working conditions, a lot of it's because people are just tired. But when teachers miss days with students, it has a significantly negative impact on their learning outcomes, and we're not seeing that. And so I think if we actually go back to districts and ask them, what's your attendance look like? You're going to hear astonishing numbers of the number of folks who are taking every day they can and then some. That hurts kids.
There was one gentleman first, and I'll...
Hi, my name is Jerry McClendon. I'm legislative aide to State Representative Darnell Brewer. So something that, I believe that we're having with this conversation is sort of looking at it from a bird's eye view and looking at it exclusively with the school. A lot of solutions, like you alluded to, I feel like we're at the front door, we're not there yet, are community-based solutions, right? So when I was in high school, right, I was actually part of the 2017-2018 cohort. That was my senior year. I went to a K-12 school, charter school, my little sister. Sometimes my little sister would get her bus pass, so we would have to walk to school. Now today, I would absolutely not walk through those neighborhoods, especially with the uniform we had. We had a blue shirt, khaki pants. We cannot wear that in those neighborhoods. Students are aware of this, so they will not go to school if they miss that bus. Also, on top of that, when I was in about 8th grade, freshman year, we were pre-algebra and algebra 1. My mom, I was like, hey mom, could you help me out with this? She said, I'm sorry, when I graduated, algebra 1 is where we stopped. So a lot of parents aren't able to help. What we need, yes, send federal dollars. Yes, improve the schools. But we need to talk to community members. I forget exactly where, but there was a school where they made a deal with the local, I'll just say it blank, community games and said, hey, from this time to this time, do not mess with the students. They're walking home and to from school. We need community solutions like that. Yes, that's an urban issue. But in rural areas, I miss the bus. My school is 30 miles away. I'm not going to walk that. I'm not going to go. You know, in suburban areas, they might have a different issue. Parents are always working because they need to fit the suburban, you know, pay for suburban life. So I'm doing this homework by myself. They already don't understand it in school, so I can't understand it here. These are solutions we need to see. Yes, the classroom is important. We need to think outside of it. You know, when I was in elementary school, I actually went to Columbus. My teacher would give us a packet for the whole week. On Monday, here's your homework, turn it in Friday. Something like that would be helpful, where we could have time to do it in the classroom. Just innovative solutions like that. Me personally, I did the homework on Monday at Latchkey, waiting for my mom to pick me up, turning the whole back and start to play basketball down the street. But I would like for us to keep that in mind, you know, especially with the district that I serve, District 18. We're one of the least affluent districts in Toledo, Ohio. We represent parts of Cleveland, Garfield Heights, and Maple Heights. Yes, they're suburbs, but they're also struggling suburbs. Something that I noticed with the study, we're doing better, but we're also doing worse at the same time. Better than what we were at one point in time, but worse than where we could be. Worse than other demographics, worse than other schools, worse than other states. I think we need to put this in mind when we're trying to legislate this, fund this, and when we have these complaint solutions. We need to look at it from a granular, on the ground level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that push on our thinking, because there are multiple perspectives, and depending on how you identify the problem and the issues, multiple solutions. Any reactions? Or?
If I could just jump in, I think tremendous insight and very powerful comments. And I think one of the challenges we have to face is figure out who does what. And I think the educators and the educational leaders, I think, have a hands full with managing what's happening in the class. I completely agree with you that that's going to be a small part of the story. But if we can't get teacher attendance back to where it was, then we're probably going to struggle solving these broader challenges in the community. And so I think for those of you in the State House, for those of you in city councils, absolutely. I think you should be doing that kind of work. But Dr. Woolard and the people running the school districts, I think figuring out what they can do during the 8 hours a day, 180 days a year that they have the students, and getting that right, I think is an important first step. And I think we could be doing more in exactly the way that Dave describes. So it's not to say that, again, it's not an either or, but I think different folks have different things that they're good at. And I think that the educators and educational leaders probably don't have the expertise in solving those other challenges that are absolutely 100% real challenges that affect what's happening in the classroom.
So I'm a soccer fan, go Crew, and we are officially in extra time. I'm going to recognize another question or two. If any of you want to leave, people always leave in extra time, so it is fine, it's not rude. Please, Jen.
Several of the comments have touched on workforce issues. Everybody has workforce issues. To what extent is there a teacher shortage?
So, you know, this is we talked a lot of challenges today that we have as educators. I think the number one we're facing, as I mentioned earlier, is teacher shortage, educator shortage, not just the absenteeism, we're experiencing that too, people coming to work less, needing more time for mental health breaks, what have you. But we're also seeing a lot more illnesses, you know, in general, and at least in my organization, and having folks that are absent in general. But I think when we talk about looking long term, there's fewer people out there in the workforce in general, and an education lack. And we talk to the colleges and universities here in Ohio, we have less students going into the educational profession. There's a lot of factors that we can make assumptions on that. I'd love to see some data on from the university level of choices or even student surveys to know that you know, education in 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we had people coming in recruiting, you know, I went to Bowling Green, I went along, there were hundreds of elementary teachers, and it was extremely competitive. You had to carry a certain GPA to even get into the program. We're not seeing that anymore. You know, we're seeing, and maybe it's because the workforce too has other opportunities, higher pay, and I think we have a lot more challenging students. You know, when we talk about wraparound services and supports that there are needed, an educator, even as a school administrator that I've been for over 20 years, this last 2-3 years have been probably the most challenging for us. And we talk a lot of the issues that we, just in the 8-hour day that we have students, that we have to tackle. That wasn't prevalent back when a lot of us went into the field. And you see a lot of retirements coming. You know, STRS just changed, you know, and lowered the average, you know, retirement age. And we're having a lot of those. I have, in both my counties, I have 4 brand new superintendents that I've had consistency for my 8 years in both counties, having all brand new, never been superintendents prior, you know, coming in. So we're seeing that changeover in the profession, even in top leadership. So I think those are the challenges we're having, but I really think that when it's all said and done, in the next 3-5 years, we have to really look at these studies that why are we lacking coming into the education profession. There are a lack of substitutes, there's a lack of bus drivers, and that's not just teaching positions. This is all positions that we are struggling to find. And we know how important it is to get kids to school. Well, a lot of our districts aren't able to have enough to put their fleets on the road every morning. So lots of challenges, but definitely need to look at some research in regards to the teaching profession.
Man, you shouldn't have asked this, but I have so many things to say about this. We were just talking about this before. I think this is an impending crisis. I think we have a lot to think about. It used to be that Ohio was a state that produced teachers for other states, that people would come in and look to kind of have our folks move to Hawaii and Alaska and all those places, and now we're desperate to keep them here. I think we have, as mentioned earlier, fewer people going in at the top of the funnel, fewer folks interested going into teaching in colleges. And this was particularly, I blame us as teachers. We do a terrible job of selling our craft. Think about it, we have a captive audience for 13 years, and we sell them out of the job, right? Instead of talking about how much we love it, how passionate we are about our work, we discourage kids from doing it. We've got to change that if we want to have our society continue to flourish. I would add to that, we have, I think we're seeing within the profession, a lack of us seeing the job as a commitment and a career. I think people see it as a job and are willing to leave it and walk away from it much more readily than they were in the past, and that has impact. Not only are we seeing fewer folks going in, we're seeing folks leave earlier in their careers as well to go do other things. And let's face it, like corporate America loves former teachers. They come in, they think differently, they're able to be collaborative, and so we see a lot of folks go and get higher paying jobs and then go on social media and talk about how much better their lives are to their friends who are still in schools. It's demoralizing. I think what we're seeing in particular is, whereas before the pandemic and years back, it's been challenging to finding a teacher who can teach physics or who can teach certain high-level courses. Those were always challenges. Now we're seeing very, very few candidates, and everyone's fighting for them. And then don't get me started on special education. I mean, that's a huge challenge, and we're only seeing the number of students who are qualifying special needs go up. And so we have fewer candidates who can do the job, and more kids who need the support. It's not, man, that sounds super positive right now. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Not great.
I was just going to ask as we wrap up, so we have talked a lot about challenges. Is there something you can point to that you feel good about that's coming down the pipe that is working with kids that you're hopeful about?
I mean, I'm going to comment, and I have commented because I think the positive piece, and then it's going back to some opportunities we've had and really embrace the COVID relief, funding and supports we've had to expand services. I mean, I think the impact we've had on students tutoring, deploying coaching models, new resources, curriculum adoptions, all of that. Now, we're not seeing immediate impact on that, and I have to say, I think we will. Every year that we have great researchers like the gentleman sitting next to me to portray, but we're not seeing that immediately. But please know, I look at what the efforts my schools have put forward, what my staff has done. These are newer and I would say more robust programming than we've ever had. In professional development, we can't expect teachers, administrators, without professional development ongoing. When we talk about all of the tagline of science of reading and all of the things that have been put forward, especially in legislation, I think we have to remember those things too and embrace too. Look what we've done with literacy since the 3rd grade guarantee. Look what we've done with, the impact with dyslexia law, and those things have made impact influence. We see that in the literacy data. But I want to just state that I think we have a lot of new things, at least from the ESC world, that we're going to continue. I have a strong sustainability plan, and we want to continue a lot of those supports. But the positive is we're thinking differently. We do have a lot of challenges, but I think let's focus on the curriculum instruction side, resources the state's deployed, all of that, and note that that will make an impact.
I'll say one thing and I'll keep it real fast, but I think and Dr. Woolard mentioned this at the top, the emphasis on literacy, and you can see it in some of the data that Vlad presented today, and that we are making progress on literacy faster than the rest of the nation. That's something to celebrate, something that's positive, and I think the leadership from the governor, and we can't say it's causal yet, I don't think, or make super sweeping claims about its impact on students, but you are seeing more schools transition to phonics, systematic phonics-based instruction, changing their curriculum, and I think that does come from the top down, from the top, where there is the leadership to try to improve literacy, really focus on it, and I think tackling some of these challenges like attendance and teacher issues is going to take some leadership from state leaders and tackling it and being forceful in terms of trying to come up with solutions that work for schools and work for kids.
So what I would add to what Aaron said is, in public policy, it's easier to do nothing than to do something. In this last budget, from both the governor's initiatives and the House and Senate, they worked really hard to tackle some of the most important education challenges we face. And it would have been easier to do nothing. So they deserve credit. And now the task on all of us, as either watchdogs or actual implementers, is to make sure it makes a difference for kids, that it was intended to, that it's implemented with fidelity. And this feels like a wrap up. So thank you very much for coming out today. If any of you came in late, I will remind you, October 17th, Ashley Berner from Johns Hopkins will be here to talk about education pluralism, and with a panel moderated by Checker Finn. So don't miss it. Thank you very much.